loads of evidence to show that we're supreme collaborators. We've got an amazing capacity for altruism and empathy and so on, and that we're happier and healthier and we live longer if we're in closely knit communities. Then that leads to much more transformative models like the 15-minute city, which is being really pushed by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. And the idea there is that you can design cities or rework existing cities so that people have access to pretty much everything they need within a 15-minute walk or cycle.
That's Michael Pawlyn, and he's discussing how a more positive view of humankind can lead in turn to the creation of built environments that promote mutualistic ways of living which are better for people and planet. Biomimicry expert, TED Talk star, and founding director of the London-based practice Exploration Architecture, Pawlyn is also co-author with Singapore-based urbanist, curator and writer Sarah Ichioka of the book Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency. Published just last year, it's a persuasive read that tackles existing orthodoxies around sustainability and posits real-world design and architecture solutions and strategies to move towards a future where the planet can truly flourish. Central to Pawlyn and Ichioka's book is the argument for a paradigm shift, and this is inspired by the late systems thinker Donella Meadows. To move away from conventional sustainability to regenerative design and development. But first, dear listeners, whether designer or brand, put all of your negative thoughts and defeatist attitudes about sustainability and it being too big an issue to solve aside. Because what we need here is to adopt a possibilist mindset. What's that, you ask? Here, Michael explains.
Possibilism was a term coined by Hans Rosling. You may have seen his amazing TED Talks, the ones he did with all those sort of dynamic graphics and so on. And the point there is really that both optimism and pessimism imply some sense of inevitability about the future. And you either feel positive or negative towards those. But the problem there is that both of those tend to see the future as something that happens to you. Whereas as possibilists, what we should do is we should decide on the future we want and then set about creating that future.
We're talking regenerative design on the Create Tomorrow podcast. And joining myself and Michael Pawlyn is Lisa White, our creative director and director of interiors. Listen in as she explains how circular design works in practice.
Yeah, we've been really focusing on, again, removing a bit of that fear factor, but also removing a bit of that, sometimes that greenwashing that happens around sustainability as well too, where a lot of corporations feel like they're doing something and say that they're doing something, but are they really doing something? And focusing much more on those practical aspects of circularity and regenerative, which have actual visual aspects to them that people can imagine and take on much more easily, because they're huge concepts as well. But those processes make them a little bit more tangible. And like one example that I like to give to audiences when I'm speaking as well too is the example of basically circular vodka. And there's a biodesigner named Kit Ondaatje-Rolls, and she recently won a prize for her alga vodka concept. So the idea is to harvest destructive algae blooms that are, clogging the waterways, but taking away that problem, turning it into a locale-specific vodka and using the leftover biomass to create the packaging. So in a way, you are, really taking care of maybe one of the problems that's happening in the ecological systems and turning it into something that could be very positive and an amazing possibility for a new source of vodka.
Yeah, well, what's nice about that is that it conveys how regenerative approaches are about having a net positive impact. It was just way too easy with sustainability to greenwash. Anything that was claimed to be better than business as usual was claimed to be sustainable. But if it's still having a degenerative approach, as in it's still somewhere short of neutral, then it's not really helping us in the long term. And I think that distinction between less bad and actually getting into the positive realm, I think that distinction is going to become clearer and clearer. And probably a few years from now, we'll just be bewildered that it took us so long to arrive at that realization, because it's so obvious once you've made that distinction. And there are a lot of other things that kind of flow from that. So I think it really redefines our notions of success, because who would want to be successful at being degenerative? Very few people. And I think that's why regenerative thinking can be a really important and useful tool for getting clients to strive for higher levels of performance and so on. Because if you can talk them through that difference between less bad and actually having a positive impact, and once they've got that, you can ask them, well, what's your long-term purpose? Do you want to be degenerative, or do you want to be regenerative? There are very few clients that would actively choose to be degenerative.
You're listening to the Create Tomorrow podcast, and we're talking to progressive architect Michael Pawlyn. At WJSN, we've talked a lot about a chance to reset following the pandemic and the social reckonings of the past 2 years. Michael discusses a similar idea in his book, and here he tells us about this systems model.
It's a tricky one to talk about in short form, because it's based on a model of how complex systems behave. And originally, this model was devised to analyze biological systems, ecosystems, and recently it's been applied to human-made systems. And actually, a lot of complex systems in society and our economies follow very similar principles. So the model suggests that complex systems go through 4 phases. There's a growth phase, then there's a consolidation phase, then there's a release phase and a reorganization phase. And it's represented as a kind of figure of 8. And in the consolidation phase in biology, that's when, say, a forest becomes more and more dominated by a single species of trees, and it can become more and more fragile and more susceptible to a release, which could be a forest fire or an insect infestation and so on. And there are similar examples within society of economies that have become more and more consolidated, so they can become more and more dominated by a few small, big players that become very resistant to change and even quite involved with government in preventing dramatic change, because they're desperate to hang on to the status quo. And so there's a question here about, what would be that release phase? Some people thought it would be the 2007 financial crisis. It was only a kind of small release in many ways. And, the pandemic is another possible one. I certainly think there will be changes that have occurred that won't go back to the way they were before. And one of those, I hope, is a changed perspective on how we relate to the rest of the living world. Because I think the pandemic will come to be seen as the end of human exceptionalism, the idea that somehow we can exist outside the rules of biology and physics, because we know now that the more we disrupt ecosystems, the more common and serious pandemics are likely to become. And so it's simply unrealistic to think that humans are separate from nature. We need to see ourselves as part of that web of life.
We've certainly integrated that, haven't we, Lisa, in our Big Ideas 2024?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a key part of our big ideas and our future innovations, even for product innovation in 2024. And I mean, the key to that is it's about designing with nature as a co-participant, because we are part of nature and we consistently forget that. It's not designing using nature and using extractive processes. So it's not just best practice, it's also about resource wisdom. If you make the process circular, if you can regenerate materials, then you're going to have resources to use in the future. I mean, indigenous peoples knew that all the time, and we have forgotten all of that. But I was thinking about this earlier, and I kind of like to compare multi-species thinking with some of the important work that's being done in diversity and inclusion right now among human beings. And that was just, such a huge focus right now too. But we're stopping at human beings in this diversity and inclusion. And we know we've got a lot of work to do there, but we need to expand that. We need to think more inclusively and with empathy about other humans in the world and how they live and how they see the world. But I would argue that we have to think more inclusively and with empathy about how other species, if they're animals or vegetables, and how they see and live in the world, because we need diversity in things in order to survive. And again, one of the examples that really resonates with mass consumers right now is the idea of bees and pollinating insects. Up until now, they were considered dangerous, painful. We didn't want bees, but now we know if there's no bees, there's no food. And one of my favorite designers, Dr. Alexander Daisy Ginsburg, did this great project for the Eden Project in Cornwall, and then now for the Serpentine Gallery in London on an art basis. And she asked herself the question, if bees were to design a garden, what would humans see? And so the idea of not designing a garden for our own purposes, but for the purposes of bees. And, basically it's, as with inclusive design, if you make the world a better place for some of the most fragile species, you make it better for everyone.
Michael, you're a biomimicry expert, right? So you've obviously talked a lot about this. Do you want to explain biomimicry for our listeners? There are some people that may not know what that means.
Yes, sure. So biomimicry involves looking at how things work in the living world and using that as a source of inspiration for new solutions that suit human needs. But increasingly, we need to see ourselves as not separate from nature, but in holistic terms rather than dualistic terms. And biomimicry has perhaps a slightly sort of mixed press because, a lot of the most publicized examples of it were just about making improvements to products, which is valid. And, there are ways of making things that use a fraction of the resources and that perform much better and so on. There's also a deeper principle or a deeper set of principles about biomimicry, which are really going to help us, I think, make progress in regenerative design, because ultimately, we need to get to the point where everything we do as humanity is fully integrated into the web of life that supports us. So there's a lot that we can learn from how life's systems function. Starting with ideas like the Gaia hypothesis that the Earth has evolved into a complex self-regulating system. And then if you work back from that, you could look at the way that life makes everything pretty much out of a very limited and safe subset of the periodic table, as Janine Benyus has argued. Whereas humans tend to use every element of the periodic table, 96% of all living matter is made out of just 4 elements. So we need to radically rethink the way we make things and the way we assemble those materials. And if we do that, then it'll be much easier to incorporate those materials and products into closed loop systems that mimic the principles of ecosystems. And just picking up on Lisa's point about perspectives and multi-species thinking and so on, I completely agree. That's essential. And thinking of your world of work of trend forecasting, I'm very interested in theories of the long-term evolution of human consciousness. And you could look at how humans, when we first emerged, the first hominids, it was a kind of pre-consciousness, very individualistic perspective, and that evolved into a tribal perspective, and then into a national perspective, and then an international one. And some people might think, well, how could you possibly go beyond a sort of global view of humanity? And we know now, it's clear, we need to go to a planetary level of consciousness that sees the importance of valuing all species, because everything is connected. And that's not just a kind of hippy-dippy notion. That's increasingly what the science shows. The limits to us as humans are not the limits of our own bodies. Our human cells, in inverted commas, are outnumbered 10-1 by microbial cells. And all of those are connected to the broader web of life support systems on which we depend. So where is the limit of the human? It's nowhere near as clear as was once thought by reductivist Western science.
For brands and designers listening to this podcast, you may wonder what these big ideas mean to you. Next, we dive into some of the ways Michael's book Flourish discusses the practical application of this more regenerative approach to design. I love, Michael, an example in the book talking of this and how we have to think, because obviously a lot of our listeners are product designers. It was an extract from Bill McDonough about a new approach to design so that all waste becomes food, either as a biological nutrient for a living system or feedstuff for technological remanufacturing, which is something we definitely are talking about a lot at WGSN. And I love that he said, for example, a hair gel manufacturer should ask themselves, what does the river that this will end up in want from the hair gel? So the question that needs to be asked is not merely what byproducts does the river want from the commodities we desire, but what does the river want us to design in the first place, and what contribution does it need us to make if it's going to have its own creative unfolding? And that, to me, just encapsulates it so brilliantly.
Well, absolutely. And that was partly Bill McDonough's thinking and partly the thinking of an Australian philosopher called Freya Matthews. So it was Freya Matthews that actually said we need to go a bit beyond what Bill McDonough said and not just ask what does the river want from the hair gel, but what does the river want us to want in the first place. And I'm sure that'll be a challenging perspective for some designers who perhaps still have a view of kind of mastery over nature, but it's increasingly a perspective that we need to adopt. And I don't see it as limiting at all. As Sarah and I have argued in our book, we see it a bit like the way you might see a fantastic relationship that you dive into. And that's a relationship full of endless depth and beauty.
I mean, Lisa, from our perspective, are you seeing many designers and brands that are progressive and are starting to think in this way?
Absolutely. There's so many designers right now too. I mean, Volleback is one of, the best examples right now too, is really thinking about how, their T-shirt designs are going to come from the earth and go back to the earth, for example. They're always blowing my mind. But, as far as like brands and companies are concerned, legally, they're going to have to think that way. Because in countries like India and Canada and the US, nations are now giving rights not just to human bodies, but to things like bodies of water and rivers and lakes. So those bodies can now be defended in a court of law when their rights have been violated. So you can go in the designer recognizing that this needs to be done, but then companies are going to have to recognize they're going to be legally challenged if they don't pay attention to what the river wants, and actually the river doesn't want.
And I imagine there'll be some people that push back about that and think, well, that sounds ridiculous, granting rights of personhood to a river and so on. But the best way of responding to that is to say, well, do you realize that companies were granted rights of personhood in the early 20th century? There was a test case, and that was the conclusion. So if a company can have rights of personhood, then surely a complex living system can be granted the same.
And I think the other interesting thing, Michael, that your book, and also, again, we're exploring a lot at WGSN, is your book talks about the custodialism of Indigenous people and how 80% of the planet's biodiversity is to be found on territories stewarded by Indigenous people, which is fascinating. That came from anthropologist Jason Hickel, I think. And we have been talking a little bit about rewilding at WGSN in the context. Certainly we have food and drink clients, so we talk about that, and for bast fibres and all of this kind of thing. But you've got a new word here, which I loved. Can you tell us that word and what that means?
Yeah, I think the one you're talking about is the word re-indigenization, which we credit to Vandana Shiva, the soil and seed activist in India. And I think the key point there is that Indigenous peoples don't see the landscape as wild. They actually see it as part of their family. That's how kind of intimate the connection is between Indigenous peoples and the web of life. And so there is now a bit of a debate about the term rewilding. I think the principles of rewilding are absolutely fantastic. And examples like the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone has now had a lot of coverage in George Monbiot's book and so on. But I think the language might shift. And we talk quite a lot about language in our book because it's so important in terms of framing the way that societies behave as a result. The kind of metaphors we use and the which we use, has a huge bearing on the way economies behave and so on. So, if we see nature as something separate to us, and if we use terms like ecosystem services rather than living systems, then it makes it seem normal to plunder those services or apply cost-benefit analysis to work out whether it makes economic sense to cut down a whole forest. Whereas if you change the language, you recognize the intrinsic value of these things rather than just the extrinsic limited value.
And I mean, to that point, something we discussed too, do you think every architecture firm needs an ecologist?
Yes, is the answer there. I think there is scope for a much more constructive involvement of biologists and ecologists. And Janine Benyus has another good line on this where she says, the typical involvement of an ecologist in a building project is that they're brought in to do the body count once the design is largely complete. And it's shifting slowly, but really we need architects to get more savvy with asking the right questions and involving ecologists and biologists very early on in the process.
You're listening to Create Tomorrow, the WGSN podcast. We're talking to Michael Pawlyn, co-author of the book Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency. When discussing the architecture and design industry, Pawlyn and Ichioka, his co-author, promote a less competitive approach, challenging the industry standards of competitions and pitches to win projects. For them, collaboration is a much healthier alternative.
What we talk about is the dominance of a way of seeing human nature as very competitive and involved in a kind of zero-sum game of survival of the fittest. And it's really frustrating that still has such a hold on us, particularly as a result of books like Lord of the Flies and various social science experiments that were done in the mid-20th century, which claim to show that humans are selfish and kind of irredeemably uncivilized, or at least culture is just a thin veneer on a fairly cruel nature.
Which is why I love that Humankind book, which I must give a plug there for.
Yes. Yeah. Rutger Bregman's Humankind is definitely a good one on the reading list. And the thing is that does affect the way we shape the built environment. So if you start with that as your perspective on humanity, then it's likely to lead to much more individualistic and isolated building forms and layouts. Whereas if you start with a more positive view of humanity, acknowledging that actually there's loads of evidence to show that we're supreme collaborators, we've got an amazing capacity for altruism and empathy and so on, and that we're happier and healthier and we live longer if we're in closely knit communities, then that leads to much more transformative models like the 15-minute city, which is being really pushed by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. And the idea there is that you can design cities or rework existing cities so that people have access to pretty much everything they need within a 15-minute walk or cycle without needing to buy a car. And that leads to much more cohesive communities with people that use far less stuff and don't need to own as much stuff. And in our book, we talk about this idea of symbiogenesis, which refers to a long-term biological process in which organisms that evolved to live in mutualistic or symbiotic ways, over time, they actually evolved new structures. New structures came into being that further enhanced that. And we think there's a really exciting potential here in the built environment to do something similar. And if we created environments that promoted symbiosis and mutualistic ways of living, then that could become a positive and self-reinforcing cycle.
Lisa, we've covered a lot about that, haven't we? We love the 15-minute city.
Exactly. And, I live here in Paris, and obviously we had a great foundation for having a close-knit community and lots of things that were really, made within a decent walking distance. But one of the things I'm thinking is really interesting in cities right now, too, is the amount of parks and green spaces as well, too. Because we know that with global warming, cities, including Paris, are getting unbearably hot in the summertime. And so one of the things that I think is interesting, too, is when you have green spaces, people go out and they meet one another in green spaces, and they're not holed up at home in air conditioning or something like that. So I guess, my favorite example is something like the tiny forest movement that, has been happening in Japan for decades, but it's being innovated and expanded upon in India with a forest. And the whole concept is to create wild, maintenance-free urban forests of indigenous species that they basically grow super thick in the space of 3 years. So going from a very genteel park is one thing, but then actually moving towards tiny forests in cities, I think is going to be really quite exciting. And again, making sure that it's not just the humans, but it's also nature that is involved in this regeneration.
Yeah, I love those Miyawaki forests.
Yes.
Michael, what sort of could you maybe cite some examples of sort of projects maybe that you've been involved with, or that you think are doing these things really well and are moving to the right sort of place with all of this?
So there was one that I jointly initiated called the Sahara Forest Project, which looked to revegetate areas of desert, and we built a version of that in Qatar, and we monitored how it functioned, and actually it was quite miraculous the way that even when you start with a bare patch of desert, if you can create the right conditions for nature to reestablish a hold, it does come back really quite quickly. And within days we had the first birds and insects, and within a month we had the first butterflies, and a little bit later we had the first dragonflies, and then we started getting visits from rare birds and indigenous mammals and so on. And all of that was achieved on really quite a small site. But if we were to do that on a bigger scale and over a longer term time scale, that regenerative effect would be even more pronounced. And then I've also worked on a zero waste textiles factory where we showed that we could get all the way to zero carbon and pretty much closed loop on water, zero solid waste, with a payback period of about 5 or 6 years. So the amazing thing is that we have all these solutions. We really do. We have all the solutions we need to make very rapid progress. And I just wish that industry could be a little less averse to these kind of changes, because there's really nothing to fear from change now. There's a lot to fear from carrying on if we carry on as we are. As Antonio Guterres says, we face an unlivable future, and in the near term. So coming back to what we were saying about release phases, I think we are now at a point where we have all the solutions we need, clearly articulated. We've got the skills to deliver them. We need a bit more of a push in terms of public demand to insist on these. And then, we can rethink the way that we operate as countries and economies, and create a much better world for everyone, genuinely.
The other things you discuss, which is sort of the notion of growth and degrowth, and the language around this. There's a brilliant analogy in the book that if you actually, the capitalist sort of system is built up to think that everything is all about growth, right? And that's what people measure countries on GDP, as you rightly explain in your book. But I love that the analogy, I think it's Edward, someone who he says, like, actually, if you just think about growth, the analogy is cancer, because that is a cell just growing and growing and growing. And that is not a positive thing if you just think of it like that. And you talk about this notion of equilibrium. Now, we have a lot of brands we work for. They're commercial. They need to grow. How can we square this off and think about this differently?
Yes. So we talk about some of the critiques of growth, including degrowth, and there's a lot about the degrowth hypothesis that I think is very good, and some very intelligent commentators. But Sarah and I don't feel that the actual framing of it is particularly helpful. And in many ways, it'd be better to look at how biology works, because biology exists with high levels of growth, decay, and renewal, and it's a balanced system. And we also need to distinguish between different types of growth. There are some things that we do want to grow. We want to repair biodiversity. We want to grow social cohesion. We want to address some of the terrible historical injustices that have occurred over centuries and so on. And then there are some things that we do need to shrink. Private jet travel and some of the most polluting activities. We definitely need to shrink those. And so what we propose as a better kind of deep purpose to drive the economy is the maximization of planetary health. So planetary health is the idea that our health as humans is inseparable from the health of the broader web of life. And that would be a much better kind of guiding light for our economies than growth. And there are still some conventional economists who are trying to hang on to business as usual by talking about sustainable growth and green growth and so on. But actually, most of it is just in the sustainability paradigm of trying to make things less bad and trying to hang on to existing business models. And it's time to really be bolder than that.
That's brilliant. And that, again, Lisa, that very much chimes with our caretaking for the future, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Our key message for 2024 to all of our clients is embracing interdependence. And businesses are becoming, people are becoming aware, but businesses are becoming aware about how connection, collaboration, and care are key to their long-term success. And that could be, a focus on global political action, on supply chain issues, which they're all focused on right now as well too, the labor market, but then also worker health, and how climate emergency is affecting and will be affecting them. And so we're talking about the care economy. And this is really going to be a paradigm shift, because the pandemic and our current global political and economical and environmental situation are really putting the importance of care for others on the planet into very, very sharp focus. And that's for consumers, but it's definitely for corporations. They need to be doing much of the work. And we were talking earlier about metrics for growth, metrics for success. But basically, it's people and natural resources that are the true wealth of nations and the true wealth of corporations. So in this care economy, we're going to be seeing renewed focus on things like healthcare and childcare systems, on the sharing economy, where resources like cars and clothes and furnishings are rented or shared. So not focusing again on extracting and producing new things, but on sharing what we already have in very wise ways, and ways that will bring a new type of growth and not cancerous growth that takes up too much energy, as you said, Bethan.
So to end, I'm going to ask potentially a tough question. I don't know, Michael, you've thought a lot about all of this. If you could change one thing about your industry, which would bring us closer to a future where the whole planet flourishes, what would it be? And then I'm going to ask you the same thing, Lisa.
Well, I'm going to cheat a bit, perhaps, because I think what we need is a tipping point. As I said earlier, we have all the solutions we need, and we need a tipping point to kind of unleash all that potential. And I mean, if I were to choose one thing, it would be really quite a strategic thing, and that would be for the UK to join the Wellbeing Group of Governments. So I think that's a really promising initiative started by Scotland, Iceland, and New Zealand, and it's now been joined by Wales and Finland. And Sarah and I talk in our book Flourish about how we'd love to see that grow and eventually supersede the G20. So in Tim Jackson's book Post Growth, he describes a meeting with someone in the UK Treasury, and he was talking about post-growth economics and so on. And the guy from the Treasury said, well, how's that going to look at the next G20 meeting when we've slipped down the rankings? And I was a little surprised that Tim Jackson didn't have a better response, because rather than trying to compete with the G20, it'd be better to just bring a completely new model into being, which currently I think is the Wellbeing Group of Governments, although Sarah and I would suggest it would be better called the Planetary Health 20.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it does require global global pulling together, doesn't it?
But it's worth reminding ourselves of how much things have changed in just 3 years. When we started writing the book, hardly anyone had heard of Greta Thunberg outside her country or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. China had yet to announce a date for decarbonisation. The Wellbeing Group of Governments didn't exist. Ideas like the donut economics were still in their infancy and now is being implemented in cities all over the world. So, sometimes it is good to look at what has changed and what could well accelerate quite a lot over the next few years.
That just leaves me to thank our guests for this episode, Michael Pawlyn and Lisa White. Do check out the book Flourish, published by Triarchy Press. And if you're a real podcast lover, Michael and Sarah host their own podcast called Flourish Systems Change, which you can find on all your podcast platforms. If you're a WGSN subscriber, you can find many reports covering regenerative and circular design solutions on our site. If you want to find out how to subscribe, head over to wgsn.com to discover how you can get access to our service. We're constantly publishing new content focusing on how we can design a brighter, better future for our industries. And these now include food and drink, beauty, interiors, fashion, and consumer tech. You can subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms. And if you like what you've heard, why not give us a rating and review? And that just leaves me to thank our producer, Roland Bodenham. Thank you for listening. Be Possibilist, and we'll see you next time.